It is co-sponsored by the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research and by the International Armenian Literary Alliance. It is my pleasure to turn the podium over, as it were, to a wonderful person, a Vanderbilt postdoc and a member of the executive committee of the Society of Armenian Studies, Helen Makhdoumyan, to introduce today's panel. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Christina, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we are certainly delighted to have Nancy, Rafi, Kearney, and Aram with us, and to share different audiences across Nasser, across the International Armenian Literary Alliance, and the Society for Armenian Studies. The plan for today is to have each of our guests read a couple of minutes, and then we will turn over to having a Q&A and a discussion. We'll transition to that later on. I will introduce each of our speakers, who will then read. And so to start us off, I am going to invite Nancy first. And so I will read Nancy's bio for us. Nancy Agabian is a writer, teacher, and literary organizer working in the intersections of queer, feminist, and Armenian American identity. She is the author of the poetry performance collection Princess Freak, published by Beyond Baroque Books in 2000, and the memoir Me as Her Again, True Stories of an Armenian Daughter, published by Aunt Lute in 2008. Her 2023 novel, The Fear of Large and Small Nations, was a finalist for the PEN Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction and the Forward Indies Award in Multicultural Fiction. A longtime adjunct writing professor at NYU and CUNY, Nancy also teaches creative writing workshops in the community. She is founding board member of the International Armenian Literary Alliance, again, one of our co-sponsors today, and she's currently based in southeastern Massachusetts. For more information, we encourage you to visit Nancy's website at nancyagabian.com. And with that, Nancy, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thanks, Christina. Thanks to SAS, NASA, and Yala for sponsoring and bringing us all together today. And thanks, everyone, for being here. Yeah, I'm excited to re-engage with this amazing anthology. My essay titled Inside the Walls that I'm going to read from documents the so-called revolution in 2018 that ousted corrupt leaders from the government of Armenia through street actions that made enormous change possible in a little over 3 weeks. Not long after that, I visited Armenia and spoke to LGBTQ activists who'd been actively involved with the protests. And the day I returned home to the US, Armenian villagers in Shernukh brutally attacked a group of young queer people. So this dismaying, contradictory event prompted me in the essay to think about homophobia as I'd experienced it in the diaspora and the role of queer people within a larger Armenian community seeking justice and liberation. Oddly enough, I found that the metaphor that really helped me was that of the house museum, and that's the passage I'm going to read from. Before the attacks in Shernukh, before the fracture, there was Zora. She was so quick to smile, and it was a pleasure to be with her, a bundle of love. Everything in Amal and Diana's apartment revolved around her. The arched windows and old double-paned glass let in a lovely light that glinted from Zora's eyes, and her coos traveled over the transom into the door of the guest room where I woke every morning. The floor plan was a central hallway with rooms opening onto rooms with swinging doors, and all paths seemed to lead to Zora, taking a nap, nursing, bathing, no matter where she was. In that revolving space, it seemed time didn't exist. From Diana and Amal's back window where we sat for breakfast, we could see the windows of Silva Gabudikian's apartment, which had been turned into a museum after her death in 2009. I didn't know of Gabudikian or her work, not even her famous poem, in which she tells her son that he can forget her, but not his mother tongue. But one of my favorite things to do in life is visit house museums. In these spaces, time seems to exist on multiple planes, the past compressed to the present. I feel close to history, understanding it more tacitly than reading a two-dimensional text. The space is intimate and clinical at once. One afternoon after breakfast, Amal carried Zora in her arms across the parking lot and up the street into the famous Poets Building. She and Diana had all the accessories of slings and strollers, but Zora rebelled against them, and Amal wanted to keep her safe in her arms. The four of us crowded into the tiny elevator, went up a few flights, and knocked on Silva's door. We encountered two women who gave us a tour. Silva's apartment was huge. The Soviets built it specially for her in 1975. Her bedroom was tiny, tucked behind a narrow passageway. On her desk nearby sat a massive dictionary that had been eaten by 37 mice. I wanted to ask how they knew the precise number of rodents, but I bit my tongue since it was the only item she possessed from her father, who died when her mother was pregnant. Additionally, I was touched by her tiny bed surrounded by heavy tapestries. Silva couldn't sleep at night during the war from 1991 to 1994. The tapestries kept out the light so that she could sleep during the day. The tour guides had known Silva personally. I widened my eyes when Amal translated this fact for me. We were standing in the kitchen, which had been repurposed as an art room for children, their paintings and drawings, inspired by Silva's poetry, covering the walls. As we approached the door and said our thank yous, one of the guys hugged me. Usually Armenians kiss both cheeks, but even showing this kind of affection seemed odd for the situation. Perhaps she wanted to bring me closer to Gabudikian's orbit. Maybe it was because I was looking at everything with great interest. When I lived in Armenia, I had trouble making sense of the harsh ways people could treat each other on the street versus the generosity they showed in their homes. Perhaps the tour guide was simply showing that famous Armenian hospitality. Perhaps her love had been compounded by the revolution. Because of economic conditions in Armenia, young people typically live with their parents until they marry. Because queer people can't marry in Armenia, they might live with their families indefinitely, and their home life can be a site of abuse. After Chernobyl, it seemed to me queer Armenians couldn't be safe on the streets anymore. They had nowhere to be safe now, not in their homes and not on the streets either. This is why spaces like Femme Library and Pink Armenian are so crucial. Sadly, these organizations cannot maintain a safe space either, forced to move from place to place. I have no idea whether Silva was supportive to queer people, but I imagine she knew some in her time operating in the world of poetry. In any case, in the timeless space of her house museum, a place both public and private at once, or neither public nor private, Diana, Amal, Zora, and I were embraced. And I'm just going to skip ahead and read one more paragraph. Writing is a space both intimate and public, like the house museum. Time compresses and stretches in these public-private institutions. Rooms get repurposed, metaphors get mixed. The hatred for queer Armenians is love that got turned upside down and inside out. It's not so much the result of a power structure, a top-down paradigm, because we're all queer in some way. Western notions of gender, what a man should look like and say and do, and what a woman should look like and say and do, have been opposed atop our own shame. To the Western gaze, a woman with a prominent nose looks masculine, and a man with large eyes and long lashes appears feminine. I once heard a joke in Armenia. It's the land of hairy women and pregnant men. In reality, There is no role reversal. We are neither feminine nor masculine. Our gender is our own, like that of a baby or an old person. This is how a revolution can be dying at the same time that it is growing. The fight isn't a steady trajectory, it's revolving like any cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. So I'm now going to introduce our next speaker. And in the meantime, I'm also going to drop the link to the book, just in case if anyone is curious. As I said, these are wonderful contributors, and there are many more contributors to We Are All Armenian Voices from the Diaspora. We are lucky to have a few of you here today. So I'll drop that link in the moment, and I will turn it over to Rafi. And by way of an introduction, Rafi is a Canadian Armenian journalist and author. He has reported from a number of the world, Nicaragua, and Canada. Rafi's book, Journey Through Genocide, Stories of Survivors and the Dead, from Dundon Press, 2018, is a personal exploration of 3 modern crimes against humanity, as the writer visits Darfuri refugees in Chad and survivors of the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, as he reflects on his own ancestors' fate in Harpet, modern Turkey, during the genocide of 1915. So please welcome our second reader and contributor from the book, Rafi.
Hi, Helen. Thanks so much for the lovely introduction. Thank you for organizing this. Aram, thank you for editing the book, and to all the other amazing contributors here and who are not here, and to our amazing audience. As you heard, my book that I wrote was heavily focused on genocide. And so when I started to write this essay, which is called The Road to Belonging, I kind of struggled to not touch on it so much because I'd written a whole book about it and 2 other genocides. And so it's really just sort of a non-linear journey through my life as a diaspora Armenian and trying to sort of define what that means and whether being a diaspora Armenian can even exist outside of the shadow of 1915. So I'm going to read the opening part, and yeah, happy to be here. So the road to belonging. Squint a little as you travel along Alberta's highways, surrounded by the flat farmers' fields that helped earn the Canadian province and its 2 neighbors to the east the designation of the prairies, and you could think you were somewhere in Armenia. The dry weather echoes the Caucasus country's own, too, pleasant in the summer. Outdoor jogs and long walks won't often leave maps of sweat stains on your clothes. The topographical similarities especially hit home when you're farther in the south, as the looming shadows of the Rockies remind you of the occasional mountains and ranges in Armenia, or the ones that are not quite there, such as Ararat, just across the border in Turkey. But today's trip won't take me anywhere near those elevations. It's June 2nd, 2018, and I'm on a bus traveling from where I live, Edmonton in the north, to a smaller city a 100-minute drive south, Red Deer. It's Alberta's annual Armenian festival, and Edmonton does not have a sizable enough Armenian diaspora community for it. Neither does Calgary, the province's most populous city. So organizers hold the event in Red Deer, a sort of geographical halfway point between the 2 larger locations, hoping to attract Armenians from both hubs. Once the bus pulls over at a hotel parking lot in Red Deer, I hop off and summon an Uber to get me to the actual place, a community hall rented out for the occasion. The driver has never heard of it and punches in the address on Google Maps. He's not the least bit curious about what kind of event I'm going to, nor who I'm meeting. It's fine, I suppose. Somehow I'm just not feeling the intellectual labor of explaining what an Armenian is to Alberta in 2016. I had never really lived anywhere in my life that did not have a big Armenian community. That year, official Canadian government figures pegged the number of Calgary Armenians at 1,010. In Edmonton, the number was lower, 620. Until then, I had lived most of my life in Montreal, Quebec, which with over 26,000 Armenians edged out Toronto as having Canada's largest Armenian diaspora population. It is March 1991, close to Easter. I'm almost 7 years old, sitting in one of two taxi cabs shuttling me and my family from Montreal Dorval International Airport to my aunt's house on our first visit to Canada, the country that will become our new home. My remaining immediate family are all in the next car along with our luggage. Other than the driver, I'm alone with my aunt, whom I have never met before. She makes conversation, and I don't recall providing much in the way of scintillating repartee. She must have me pegged for a shy little boy, which, to be fair, I was. But I'm also mesmerized by what I can see outside my window. Along the entire stretch of Highway 40, sets of streetlights brightening the way. In the Beirut of the 1980s, where and when I was born, it was not uncommon to spend most of the day experiencing power outages. How much electricity does Canada have that it can just afford to keep the entire autoroute illuminated? The sheer vanity of it both impresses and vaguely upsets me in a way 7-year-old me would likely struggle to articulate. Later, at my aunt's place, the wonders continue. The hot water tap actually releases hot water on command. The cold water is potable. The Armenian community in Montreal is younger and smaller than the one in Beirut, which is one of the oldest and biggest outside Armenia proper, but it is also by and large wealthier. So, whom did I have more in common with after spending the rest of my childhood in Montreal? Armenians in Beirut or Canadians? It is 1998, and 7 years after crossing the world from east to west, I've been on a journey a couple of days long going back the other way, from Montreal to Frankfurt and Frankfurt to Yerevan, Armenia. I've been traveling without my family this time, part of an organized trip with the Hominid Men Armenian Scouts Montreal chapter. The idea is chapters from across the world gather in Armenia for a 2-week summer camp. We call it a jamboree officially. The title is meant to differentiate from the smaller, more traditional annual summer camps in our own backyards. Finding the cheapest airfare possible for this large of a group has meant that old favorite of international travel, a long layover somewhere at a midway point. In this case, that somewhere is Frankfurt International Airport, which in part is cool. I get to add more to the list of countries I visited. Unfortunately, it also means we're there for just about 12 hours. Some of the others have entertained themselves, playing soccer in the passenger waiting area. It's a cup year, and such a commercial starring the Brazilian team is just too fun an imitation to pass up. Well, for most of us, Armenians have a kind of obsession with soccer. It's not as if our national team has ever cut a large profile on the world stage, but we remain ever hopeful. I'm not part of the Hominid Men soccer team, though many of my friends in the Scouts do play. The other difference between me and them is they're actually good at it. By the time we get to Armenia, it's early in the morning on a hot August day, and I'm spent. Right there on the tarmac, one of my friends decides it is time to show his lifelong appreciation of Armenia immediately. I'm going to get down on my knees and kiss the ground, he says. I tell him I won't be doing that because I think it's unhygienic. He dismisses my unpatriotic concern, kneels, and performs his ritual of loyalty. I watch him and wonder if I'm at fault for not being Armenian enough. That's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rafi. So I'm going to introduce our third reader, Kearney Rose Mugardichan, and let me pull up your bio, please, for 1 second. All right. So Kearney is an artist, organizer, educator, and proud Black Armenian Angelino. She is drawn to storytelling that centers marginalized narratives and firmly believes that art exists to spark empathy and creative social change. It's a lovely message for today and our current moment. Her plays and spoken word have been produced at Edinburgh Fringe, Meet QLA, Company of Angels, and Independent Shakespeare Company. She's been published by the University of Texas Press, LAist, the Armenian Weekly, Hybrid Magazine, and Queries. She was co-founder and values steward of the Yerazad Coalition, artistic associate for social justice at Independent Shakespeare Company, and program coordinator at Support Black Theater. She teaches with Center Theater Group, Creative Arts, and about productions, and has guest lectured at several places, including USC and UCLA. She received her training from Dartmouth College and the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here and for having me. I'm going to read some sections from my piece, which was titled Perspectives on Artsakh from a Black Armenian Angelino. And for context, this piece was originally published in 2020, just in the midst of everything that was happening with the genocidal attack on Artsakh. And I'm going to focus more on the sections of the piece that are centered on identity, and specifically my identity and my family history and activating our community. But a big part of the piece was also trying to reach out and explain to the local LA community what was happening and why, and the historical context that was missing from a lot of our publications at the time. Here in LA, I am surrounded by the largest diasporan Armenian population, and yet I've struggled to feel connected to this community in which I felt I wasn't seen or wanted. I remember walking through the Glendale Galleria holding hands with my parents and seeing the stares from other Armenians as they turned to whisper with each other. This was not the case with the Black community. I remember my first day at Ivanhoe Elementary School when my soon-to-be friend Aaliyah came over to me and said, "We are both Black girls. We have to stick together." This unconditional acceptance has remained true throughout my life. When we would visit my mom's side of the family on the south side of Chicago, my light skin resulted in some hurtful taunts. There were girls on the playground who said they didn't want to play with a vanilla ice cream girl. My cousin Ayana set them straight as I left the park crying. I was called everything from yellow to light bright. Family members would playfully joke about my last name, calling me McKetchup because they couldn't handle the pronunciation. All those otherizing experiences aside, I navigated Black spaces with an ease I still don't feel anywhere else. Both my parents ensured I understood the history and the suffering of my ancestors. I remember my mother sitting me down one day when I must have been 5 years old or so and explaining the history of slavery in the United States and our continued struggle for justice. Well, I don't remember what sparked that conversation. I remember it knocked me right out of my California bubble. The idea of someone hating me because of my skin and features was foreign to me. I first became aware of my Blackness around the same age. My Armenian cousin said, "Even if you have just one little drop of Black, the people, like at your school, will only see you as Black." "But I'm both," I remember saying, upset because I had no understanding of the one drop rule. Although he didn't fully understand the implications of what he said, it still hurt. It has always been a strange paradox to acknowledge the fact that the United States, a nation built by Black slaves on stolen indigenous land, has given my Armenian family freedoms and opportunities they never could have imagined under the Soviet Union. I accept this truth while also understanding this country is steeped in systemic white supremacy. Even with my light-skinned privilege, I myself have been subjected to racial slurs, followed in stores, unjustifiably pulled over by the police, and forced to endure countless microaggressions. The dismissal of these disparities by some Armenians who boast that our community is self-made is inherently racist and feeds into the flawed, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality glorified by so many immigrant communities. I believe it is hard for many Armenians to understand that they too benefit from white supremacy, despite our indigeneity, the genocide, and the uniqueness of ethnic Swana identity. Now I'm going to skip forward. I am the direct descendant of Armenian genocide survivors. We were lucky enough to have my grandtatik Navart with us until 2017, and she helped keep our family history alive. Her husband, Garagin, was my tatik's father and born in Van and survived the genocide. Garagin didn't say much about that time, but there are some details our family has remembered and carried with us. When Garagin was 8 or 9, he was chased into a river along with his little brother by Turkish soldiers and survived by holding on to the tail of an ox to get across safely. The last he saw of his little brother, he was carried away by a Turkish officer on horseback. At some point, Garagin made his way to Echmiadzin Church. At the church wall, he found what remained of his family. There is uncertainty as to who was left, but he did see his mother, father, and at least one sister. Apparently, upon first seeing his mother, he went to get her food, and when he returned, she had died. His father and sister died soon after, all stricken with cholera. Before or after this encounter, Gergen was placed in an American orphanage in Jerusalem. My papik's mother, Ashken Mayastan, who also survived the genocide, never knew her true age. One story from the genocide that she recounted with my papik and his brothers has stuck with me over the years. Her mother, Tamar, was nicknamed Sirun Tamar because she was known for her beauty. When Turkish soldiers came looking for her, she smeared her face with dirt, tattered her clothes, and told them they took her already and went that way. At some point, Ashken lost her father, mother, and 2 other siblings, but those details have never been discussed in my family. Ashken, her sister Arus, and her brother Gurgen ended up in an American orphanage in Gimri. They were lucky to have each other. At that time, many surviving Armenian girls were converted to Islam and forced into sex slavery and marriages. Some were tattooed on their faces and hands as a mark of their ownership. It is this understanding of my family history and our shared intergenerational trauma that tethers my spirit to my ancestors and our Armenian community. I'll skip a little bit. Now, a few days before the fighting began on September 27th, a number of Armenians were engaging in a ridiculous and hurtful debate online about Armenian identity. Some argued that marrying and having children with non-Armenians will lead to the loss of our culture and identity. Having to argue the validity of my existence was frustrating, but I found that most people engaging in the discussion were overwhelmingly supportive of multiracial Armenians. We carry our ancestors in our souls. No amount of cultural gatekeeping and adherence to quote unquote blood quantum can ever take that away from us. Whenever Armenia is under attack, we stand united, no matter what our differences are. It is my sincere wish that this unity remains once we make it through this crisis. We see this genocidal war on Artsakh as an existential threat to the Armenian diaspora. Armenians have been indigenous to Artsakh for thousands of years and had no incentive to start a war over the small bit of land we already have. And then I explained a bit more about what was happening to folks, and I will end with the latter part of that after I explain the context. Armenians are shutting down your freeways and marching in your streets because we want your attention. We want as much coverage and visibility as possible. We know what happens when governments choose neutrality over people, and we refuse to allow this attempt at ethnic cleansing to go unnoticed. Now, it doesn't come as a surprise to me that people have no interest in engaging with what is happening in Armenia. The conflict seems distant and confusing, and it's so much easier to focus on the election and pandemic instead. When the movement for Black Lives was reignited in June following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, I was amazed at the sheer number of allies who emerged among friends and communities that had stayed silent for so long. I had attended my first Black Lives Matter protest in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown, and in the years since, we have lost and continue to lose countless Black lives to law enforcement and lynching. It hurt to see this sudden mobilization of allies because I understood that you all had the ability to fight alongside us this entire time, yet you chose the comfort of your privilege instead. Whether it's a selfie at a protest, an empty black square, or the continued memification of Breonna Taylor, these actions are meaningless without substantive direct action to back them up. Performative activism is useless and often harmful. It is safe to say that the spike in activism we saw at the start of the summer has died down, and people are returning to their natural state of apathy and privileged ignorance. I am here to tell you that it is possible and necessary to care about more than one issue at a time. Your taxpayer dollars are funding Azerbaijan, and President Trump has business interests in both Turkey and Azerbaijan, so this is your fight as well. Just as I called on the Armenian community to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, I am now pleading with everyone who takes the time to read this to fight for your Armenian friends while we are still here. At least 100,000 of your fellow Angelenos marched in the streets in one weekend demanding you listen to us. Like all Armenians, I had been a mess since the attack, alternating between frantic action and catatonic anxiety. It filled my spirit to see Black, Assyrian, Filipino, and Mexican allies standing with us in solidarity. It is my sincere hope that you, my fellow Angelenos, join us in condemning this continued attempt to erase Armenians from this earth. The Armenian diaspora is so vast, rich, and diverse in spite of the loss of much of our indigenous land and our continued struggle for survival. Like Garagin and Ashken, we persevere and thrive in the face of adversity. I always say that as a Black Armenian woman, I am the proud legacy of two failed genocides. The failure of these genocides is dependent on your commitment to speaking truth and ensuring that history doesn't repeat itself. Our existence is resistance, and we aren't going anywhere. Thank you.
Great. So Nancy, Rafi, and Karani, we thank you for reading from your rich contributions. In the next half of our webinar, we are going to turn over to Q&A and discussion, which Rafi is generously going to moderate for us. But before we transition over and Rafi takes the lead on that, I want to make note that Aram Bourgeoyan, editor, will be joining us for this portion. Yes, hello. And so I'd like to just briefly introduce Aram. And let me get your updated bio. Perfect. So Aram is a writer, editor, critic, and educator. He earned a PhD in creative writing at Florida State University and an MFA at Northwestern. Aram has also served as a creative writing mentor or instructor at Adroit Journal, 826, Hugo House, Story Studio, and Open Books Chicago. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, Runner's World, Literary Hub, Catapult, West Branch, Electric Literature, among others, and he is currently the editor-in-chief of The Rumpus. His debut novel, Waterline, is forthcoming in 2025, and we will certainly look out for that. And so, Rafi, I turn it over to you for this next portion.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Helen. So in order to sort of speed things along, I'm going to ask if you have questions to please drop them in the chat. You can direct those directly to me by choosing who to write to, or you can just write to everyone and I will read out your question to whoever it's directed to, or if it's for all of us, then I'll do that and we can keep moving from there. So yeah, please chime in if you got any questions. Not everyone all at once, though. Okay. So there's one question to keep us all going from Helen. I'm going to read these in the order they pop up, by the way. So what does it mean to each of us to be a part of the book, and how does being part of a book make you think through this concept called diaspora in general, or the Armenian diaspora in particular? So for whoever wants to jump on that first, please go ahead.
I can start. I would just briefly say that for me, being someone who is Black and Armenian and having experienced so much more inclusion in our community in recent years than I had felt throughout much of my life, it definitely felt like an honor to be included in this space, and that our voices of Armenians who are mixed, Armenians who are queer, Armenians who don't necessarily fit the mold or the idea that we tend to have, or that certain folks in our community tend to have, of what it means to be Armenian. I was honored to be included amongst such a diverse array of folks in this volume. And it was really heartening for me just reading through all of the pieces as well when I had received the copy, to be like, oh wow, there's so much. Because I think oftentimes, especially some of the youth that I speak to in our community who are just coming up, the young Armenian organizers out here, young Armenian progressive organizers, sometimes feel that they don't necessarily have a space in our community, or for them to be active, they can't activate or work in solidarity with other people in connection to our community and in connection to the Armenian community. So I'm happy to see that there are more of us that are being given a platform and holding space so that they can see that they are absolutely included as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Kearney. Aram or Nancy, do you want to jump in there?
Sure, I can hop in for a minute. And I guess what I'll say is, and maybe to kind of answer the second part of the question first, is when I started thinking about the collection, when you're working on your own book, you know why it's important to you. And there's like kind of this self-enthusiasm, but you don't know what it's going to mean to anyone else yet. Um, and so I kind of wanted to think through this concept of diaspora, but wasn't exactly sure what that looked like. And what was meaningful to me is all your contributions. Like when I reached out, just seeing the work coming in was overwhelming because I think it was this question that I was trying to figure out, like what is the concept of diaspora and what does it mean in this moment? And, what are some of the things that I've seen other Armenian writers trying to grapple with that I haven't really been able to figure out, or that like we'd kind of like, I had these relationships with different writers kind of behind the scenes where I was like, it's really interesting what you're working on and I want to learn more about it. Um, and so it came together pretty organically and then like has been just, I think, really meaningful seeing it go from this thing that I thought was just an idea that was like kind of a project for me and seeing it then, mean something to other people.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Nancy, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I ditto to what Karani said about inclusion, and the importance I think this volume has for young people to see themselves represented, or for anyone who feels outside of the community, to see that those feelings expressed. And I think one element that one has when reading this is that feeling of the perfect Armenian. It just falls away. And I think an anthology can generate community. And one thing I've really appreciated selfishly is like reading these pieces and re-engaging. And I'm grateful to read Rafi, your piece, and Kearney, your piece today. Like Kearney, I think the line about two failed genocides was so valuable for me. I think thinking about genocide as a failure is so important for us and for everyone in this moment. And Rafi, I think your question about is genocide the only reason for a diaspora? I think such a rich and important question. So just to echo that, our voices form this kind of chorus, but then I think the individuality of each contribution just gives a lot of dimension to what our community is.
Thanks so much for that, Nancy. I will say I have similar feelings as my fellow authors and editor on this. I really enjoyed seeing the parallels, similarities, differences between the different essays in the book. It sort of felt like I was looking through this prism about diaspora and, reading each author's essay. I was like, oh, that's very similar to what I experienced growing up. And this part is completely different than what my life experience has been like. And I just really appreciated sort of exploring the richness of what diaspora means through the book. I guess part of me was also, I had never really contemplated what being a diaspora Armenian means to someone like my grandmother before I started writing this essay. And as I was tackling it, it was, she was one of the genocide survivors of 1915 in our family. And I guess spoiler alert, if you haven't read my essay, I kind of end up saying, well, we can't really escape from talking about it if we're going to talk about diaspora Armenians. So there's a part of it where I delve into little bits of her life, and it's like, to her, being a diaspora Armenian meant that she escaped from Eastern Turkey, she moved to Lebanon, then she moved to North America, the United States first, then Canada, and she essentially spent the last part of her life kind of flying between these two countries to make sure she can spend as much time as possible with her children and grandchildren who had settled in different parts of the world. There's one part of her family that I don't think she ever saw again, because after Lebanon and the war there, they moved to Australia, which is kind of crazy in a way. Like when I tell you know, some of my non-Armenian friends, yeah, and part of my family lives in Australia. It's literally the other side of the world than where I live, and it seems impossible to fathom, but it's also just what life is like for a lot of Armenians. So I guess these are the reflections I started having as I was writing this essay. Yeah. Maybe I'll just move on to the second question that I saw. I don't think it's directed at anyone in particular, though. Aram, I guess you may want to tackle this first because it is, what was the motivation for creating this volume at this moment in time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I should say it's interesting that, to clarify at this moment in time, really this anthology started 4 years ago, if not a little bit longer. It started as a conversation with the University of Texas Press in February 2020, and got approved, for potential publication in March 2020, right at, I think the same week as the pandemic was kind of, unfolding, was when I was having this conversation with them. And I think part of the motivation was what I was talking about is I was writing about Armenian identity in my own work and connecting with a lot of different Armenian writers, and truthfully feeling like it was a kind of very spectral, nebulous part of myself. And I think that's part of why I found, community, talking to other writers who were talking about this, talking about ethnicity and talking about culture. Um, and, from there going, well, like, okay, like what does this look like if we put together an anthology that really is inclusive, that really can examine, a much larger spectrum of kind of how we relate to Armenianness than what is maybe found in popular culture. And that was really, I think, kind of the central, goal of the anthology when putting it together, is really trying to expand, break down some boundaries and expand kind of that definition. Um, and it was a 3-year process from kind of when we started talking about it, or when I started talking about it with the press, to asking all of you for contributions, to eventually publishing it, about just over a year ago, in March 2023. And I think the part that's interesting, and the reason I'm trying to give you a timeline a little bit, is because so much has happened since then. And even coming back to this collection now, in 2024, and thinking about it versus when it kind of got started, um, it's amazing. Like, I think, my motivation remains the same, and I think the book remains vitally important in what it's talking about. But there's also, like, these last 2-3 years of current events that have made me wish, like, oh, I wish I could add more to this, or like I wish that the writers who I asked for content, and particularly, like, having worked with a lot of you, over that 3-year period, that was one of the tough conversations, I think, to field, is like, we see what's happening in real time. Does that change, our contributions? Publishing slow. And so I think that was one of the tricky parts of it, is that feeling like it was both absolutely the right time, and also like that we're just always catching up.
If we adapt that to what was your motivation for writing this essay at this moment in time, I don't know if Nancy or Kearney, you'd like to weigh in on that, or we can also move on to the next question, however we're feeling.
Yeah, I would just share that when I wrote this piece initially and when it was originally published by LAist, it was definitely an urgent piece, and I for some context and background, I reached out and I had written quite a bit, and I definitely had some questions about things, and that's why some of the language or some of the titles and things like that, those were also put in by that editor, because there were like, okay, we have to make sure that everything we can link to something else, and we can, show that this is factual and all of that. And I had to keep explaining, even within the piece that I was writing, that was definitely a personal piece, but that, okay, here is the history, these are the facts, this is everything you can reference. And it ended up getting a very large reaction for them from the community, because obviously there's a huge Armenian community here, but also a lot of folks in the community who didn't know or didn't understand what was happening, or didn't understand why they were seeing all of these Armenians in the streets with these flags, and what was going on. So it was really an activation, and I felt like I needed to do what I could to not only activate other members of our community, but also to connect the Armenian community to what was just happening in June with the Black Lives Matter movement, that a lot of them had chosen to ignore, or were actively being harmful during that time as well. So
Nancy, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. So I had started this essay before the anthology came about. I did feel moved and did feel urgency to write something about the revolution as it was unfolding, because it was so phenomenal in that moment, and wanted to say to like progressives, like, hey, look at this amazing thing that's happening in Armenia that no one is looking at. And I think the revolution was really, looking back now, it's hard to remember that it was also really questioned early on if it really was a revolution. And that's a question that the essay takes on. For me, that question came up very powerfully when the queer folks in Chernobyl were attacked. And so to like pull apart what this means to me as a diaspora Armenian kind of got me to a place of thinking, what does Armenian liberation look like for all of us in diaspora and homeland and queer Armenians? And I was glad I had the time to figure that out during this strange moment of the pandemic. That like there could be like a reflection point, even though so much has happened since then.
Thank you, Nancy. I guess I'll just say for my part, when I wrote this essay, I think I finished it right before the Artsakh war happened in September 2020. And so my motivation then was just wanting to explore a form of writing that I'm not extremely familiar with. I just don't do first person introspective essays about myself. I mean, Journey Through Genocide is in part in first person, but it's also based on a whole lot of interviews with a lot of genocide survivors that I met in the field. My usual journalism these days is about, Canadian federal politics, and it's like 2-minute TV or radio stories. So I was sort of energized by the challenge of writing this, and probably asked way too many annoying questions to Aram about whether putting this in is okay, or if it's too much. And he was very encouraging about it. So that's kind of what pushed me to do it. Adam alluded to some of the challenges about the timing of the book's publication and editing and so on. Uh, I mean, I was struggling with that a little bit because, in my initial draft, I'd written just a little about Artsakh, and I didn't end up expanding on that a whole lot because then it was just going to take over the entire essay, and we had already pretty much agreed on what an edit would look like. And I did find it challenging as like someone, especially who in his daily life is always covering the news, so I was like, wait, this is just frozen in amber now, like this is the essay that's just going to be there. And I just had to accept that that's how these things work sometimes. So yeah, it was great to write. That that part was a bit of a challenge, I guess, the weight and figuring out how much we can change or not. Um, I'll move on to the next question. It's directed at everyone again. It asks, do you believe that activism and slash or resistance is an important part of what diaspora means to you? Does that connect you to other Armenian diasporans or not? Whoever would like to jump in there.
I would say it is an important part for me. It's definitely what's connected me to a lot of members of our community through organizing and through the organization I co-founded, Yedizad Coalition. And I also think that it's a really powerful way of connecting us with other communities as well. I will say that sometimes activism and organizing can be a way of distancing yourself from some members of the community as well, just depending on what the organizing is around. Because, of course, we are not a monolith and there are very different views and experiences in our community. But I do think, especially now with what is happening, and if we want to have the keep the land that we have left, it is very critical that everyone mobilize in the ways that they can, use their voices in the ways that they can, and their voices, their body, everything that we can to support Armenians in the homeland, to support Armenians in the diaspora as well, who are organizing around various causes to support Armenian education in our schools. And at least I know that's been something that's happened in Los Angeles school district, and I know there was something happening in New York school district. So there's a lot of ways that we can organize and resist that isn't necessarily you have to be in the street with a sign. I think all of that is a form of resistance, but of course there's so much more that also connects us, like our culture and traditions and language and food and all of that as well.
Thanks, Karani. Does anyone else want to weigh in? Nancy?
I think it's important to remember that we have agency, whether we define it as activism or resistance, because I think we're kind of told, especially in the US, that we have power in the diaspora, and I think we feel a certain responsibility that comes with that. But I also think it's important that we find it for ourselves. I liked what Karani said about the different forms it could look like. And yeah, I think we're actually at a moment when Armenians worldwide probably feel really fractured. We've endured a lot of trauma recently. And so I think just asking the question is a hopeful question, Judy, that to think about, where we have, like, where and how do we find our strength? And I think an anthology can do it, and I think conversations like this can do it, that it can lead to action that's helpful for us and helpful for Armenians.
Okay. I know we're getting a little bit close to the hour length, so we'll probably just take this next question and maybe get close to wrapping it there. It is also a question that happens to be directed at Carney and me. It says, your talks touched a little bit on this, but could you speak a little about Armenian identity and how it relates to Armenians settling on indigenous lands in North America? I'm writing from the unceded Musqueam territory in what is known as Vancouver, Canada. Shout out to Canada, and the other Canadian on here. I don't know if Carrie, you want to go first or?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. I am coming at you from the unceded land of the Gabrielino Tongva people, also known as Los Angeles. I think that it is critical as an indigenous people, Armenians, as an indigenous people who have and continue to lose our lands and have obviously been pushed into diaspora for various reasons, but also have to acknowledge that we have settled in places that on land that is not our own. One of the things that I speak quite a bit about, and that's part of our organizing with Yedizat, is making sure that we're doing everything that we can to show up for Indigenous folks where we are and supporting land back movements wherever they are, because we as a people, and that's the sort of cognitive dissonance that I see oftentimes in some leadership in our community. We as a people, we can't advocate or speak to all of these things that happen to us or have happened to us or happen in our history and then perpetuate that harm and not try to do what we can to support communities that are experiencing what we have also experienced because we know it intimately. So the and everyone always is like, how do you do that? How do you support land back movements? I always say that it's great to just start at an extremely local level and look at the land in which you are, the land on which that you are occupying, where you are located, looking at whoever that land belongs to, whether it is a very, so specifically in Los Angeles, the Gabrielino Tongva people, they have a conservancy. They also have a way that people can pay a certain land tax if you are someone who actually owns land, to support them. A lot of organizing and activation. And that's really the core things that folks are advocating for, legislative things that they want. Certain tribal recognition, some of them are not nationally recognized, and that can impact a whole range of things. Some of them don't want the national recognition. So just really supporting the people upon whose land you are occupying and whatever their journey is as a community and what their decision is as a community to the best of your ability. But it's definitely something that we have to speak on and be aware of because we can't ignore it. And it's the same thing when we talk about the systemic racism that we see in this country. Again, like whiteness is a thing that Armenians in America specifically have earned. That is something that was earned through legislation. We still experience a lot of racism and harm here. We experience redlining. Like there are a lot of things that we as a people have experienced, but when time passes with certain communities and certain immigrant communities, they can sort of achieve a sense of whiteness or a proximity to whiteness. And we as a people have to get away from that. And we have to start looking towards building solidarity with the other marginalized folks that we're holding space with.
Thanks for that, Carney. I'll get to the question itself, but it's funny you mentioned achieving whiteness because um I've always felt like growing up Armenian and in the midst of a diaspora Armenian community that like there's always this struggle about, are we white? Are we not white? And I don't really think of myself as white because I have this really long name that's often unpronounceable and, I look like what I look like. And I have Armenian friends who will push back the other way and say, why not? And So it kind of it's still a hanging question with me, and I just sort of say, okay, well, define yourself the way you want to define yourself, and I'll do the same for me. And I guess I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on that. But as someone whose passport says he's born in Lebanon and who's definitely been picked out of, at airport searches, I'm like, I'm just not sure that I'm white or ever will be. As for the reflection on indigenous questions, I mean, yeah, Ottawa, where I live now, is on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. In my daily life as a journalist, I mean, to kind of answer the last question too, I can't really engage in activism. It's just, because of professional codes of conduct I follow, etc. But what I try to do is just kind of bring those stories to the fore and make sure they are in the public conversation. And when we do, when the opportunity to do those stories presents itself, I'll throw my hand up and say I want to do that story because I do think it's important to be talking about that stuff more. I do think in Canada we've seen sort of an uptick in conversations around indigenous land recognition, with the schools, the residential schools issue that started coming more to the forefront a couple of years ago. There has been a bit more opportunity to talk about these issues, the potential unmarked graves that we've done lots of stories about over the last couple of years. I've tried to work every time there has been a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in the last few years, which is just a really new sort of official federal holiday that we've only started marking since 2021. And I'm just sort of trying to keep track of what is the general kind of interest in the Canadian population in these questions. I feel like there's an ebb and flow there. The first year that I covered the ceremonies here in Ottawa in front of Parliament Hill, there was a really large crowd. And then the second year, it was still sort of there. I felt like last year was a little smaller. So I'm curious to see where this goes, and I want to keep an eye on this for sure. Yeah. Um, yeah. Well, that's it for me. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in there or. I also don't see any further questions in the chat, maybe because I said that was the last question.
Yes, that seems like a wonderful place to stop, to come to an end. Only for today. Hopefully, there will be more. I want to thank all of our speakers for their time and their generous thoughts. And I want to also say to you all and to your fellow contributors, if we've seen anything today, is that you are all our knowledge producers. And so we are grateful for you all for your contributions. I think I can say for all of us, should there ever be a volume 2 or 3, we will certainly be delighted. So here's to the future and wherever it ends up taking you all, and to us or others in diaspora. Thank you again to our co-sponsors, to the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research and the International Armenian Literary Alliance. And thank you all for being in the audience today on a Saturday of all days, and keep your eyes out for future events. And with that, thank you all for your time and thoughts and for being here with us. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.